And a lot of people don't like rules, especially when there's too many rules or rules that you find in your workplace or even at home don't really fit what you think is necessary. That's fine. It's understandable. But as cumbersome as rules or what we call government regulations can be, it is a well-documented fact, a nonpartisan, international, proven fact that when you have too few rules or the wrong people get to cancel existing rules for their own selfish interests, you have something far worse than the idea that there's some annoying rules or regs around. You have huge danger. That is the point we're going to get into tonight. But let me start with the markets. We were just talking about this earlier tonight. We've been talking about it for weeks. Trump's trade war has the markets smoked, spooked, volatile, down. Indeed, to put it in context, reports show that the Trump slump is the steepest concentrated sell-off for American stocks, on par with both the speed and the intensity of the type of sell-offs or drawdowns, as they call them, Reuters points out, since the infamous and damaging financial crisis in 2008. And the Times reports bad news for Trump on this as people learn about it, that unlike that 2008 crash and the other one, what they call the two previous crashes of the past 20 years, this crisis, quote, would have been directly attributable only to one man, Donald Trump. So let's just take that in order. Pretty simple. The first point is Trump's policy failure is so bad that it is actually on par with massive global crises. The thing he did with his tariff idea was on par with a multi-year brewing housing market crash that cost a lot of people their homes and their jobs. The second point is relevant to our special report. That wider government cuts, slashing regulations, bringing a chainsaw to them, as Musk has literally claimed, have huge, hidden, delayed costs. Let me explain why. And this is well documented. That 2008 crash, which was compared to Trump's tariff slump, was not exactly driven by politicians taking an action, but it was driven by inaction, or how politicians, especially on the right, but not only on the right, because some Democrats joined, how they disassembled parts of the government and slashed the rules for Wall Street and the housing market. The Bush administration had many problems, you might recall, also was dealing with wars. But it was the Republican-led deregulation, which included the Bush administration and started even earlier, and we could show you the headlines, that proved to cause problems that didn't just shake the financial markets, they upended the global economy. And as I said, cost many people homes and jobs. Here's one report from NBC about how the Bush administration backed off the crackdowns you would have on no money down interest-only mortgages before all of this. And they, quote, buckled to pressure from some of the same banks that then failed in that crisis I'm mentioning. A California lender wrote to regulators a year before that implosion, expect fallout, foreclosures, horror stories, because there were no rules to ensure that people who couldn't afford mortgages weren't just getting them from greedy bankers who didn't care about externalizing the costs or the famous, terrible bailouts that the markets basically demanded. Bush also gutted the key Wall Street regulators. Keep that word in mind, regulators, because we're hearing a lot about Musk going after all the different regulators. Fewer cops on the beat, companies were getting away with risky practices for their own greed. But it would later be you, the public, and the government holding the bag, not the greedy corporations. Complicated story. You might have seen some of the movies about it. I'm going to show you one movie clip, but the point here is simple. When you take out all the rules and the people who enforce the rules, a lot of big, bad, greedy people can take advantage. Now, you might recall The Big Short, a movie based on the real events that fomented the clash. Now, there's a fictional scene that refers to the breakdown of government rules. It draws on, however, the reporting by a legendary journalist, Michael Lewis, who wrote the nonfiction book, The Big Short. So what I'm showing you is a dramatization of a real thing. No government cops on the beat. Housing bubble getting even bigger. And even when the signs were there, people who couldn't pay mortgage loans were being given ridiculous loans that the people giving them out knew they couldn't pay, which created the bubble that popped. Take a look.
So do applicants ever get rejected?
Seriously? Look, if they get rejected, I suck at my job.
Well, even if they have no money?
Well, my firm offers ninja loans. No income, no job. You know, I just leave the income section blank if I want. Corporate doesn't care. These people just want homes, you know, and they go with the flow.
Good for you.
Your companies don't verify.
If I write a loan on Friday afternoon, big bank is going to buy it by Monday lunch.
Yeah, same here.
No problem, right? Except there was a huge problem. That scene is showing those investors asking the questions that no government regulators were around to ask. Later, there were even Wall Street voices who admitted all the government cuts, this deregulation, this Musk-style attack on all these different things that we're not supposed to be thinking about every day because you're supposed to just have the rules enforced, ultimately kneecapped the needed oversight.
There were large portions of the financial system that were not adequately covered by the regulatory oversight.
You can say that again. The consequences of shredding those rules became clear. The collapse of the mortgage market, the cascading events you probably remember, major banks going under, which endangered all of the deposits they had, all the people's money. It was the biggest crisis since the Great Depression.
The country's second biggest subprime mortgage lender was teetering on the brink of bankruptcy today.
He has no idea how bad it is out there. He has no idea. He has no idea.
A record number of home foreclosures.
3 of the 5 biggest investment banks are gone. The country's biggest mortgage lender is gone. The 2 big government-sponsored entities, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, brought under government control.
Meltdown. The American financial system is rocked to its foundation.
It was a disastrous meltdown. It ruined many people's lives. There are people who never really got their footing again, never really recovered, never really got back to a place where they could own a home or get the right job. Some other people recovered. It took years. What you see there, and this is important because so often the news we're talking about today and maybe a little bit of tomorrow, but not the years back and the years ahead. What you see is the risk of what Trump and Musk are doing, because the story that ended with that meltdown started with disassembling government rules like the ones I showed you. A catastrophic failure with a lack of federal oversight that has been documented, studied, and proven. Again, nonpartisan point. It was the mess that actually also affected politics because it was in an election year where Obama said there's a lot of things we got to change, and he came into office vowing to deal with, above all, that deregulation crash.
One of the most significant contributors to our economic downturn was an unraveling of major financial institutions
Not adequately covered by the regulatory oversight.
And the lack of adequate regulatory structures to prevent abuse and excess.
The job of the public sector is to try to set up a set of rules that allow you to maximize the benefits of these innovations and minimize the damage.
Insured banks in this country are trading in derivatives on their own proprietary accounts. You could just put a roulette wheel in the bank lobby.
History in the making. The Dow plummets more than 777 points, its biggest one-day point drop.
We lived through it, and we've learned a lot about the causes. And it is a tiny investment to have government regulation and cops on the beat. The disassembly of those government regulators and the regulations is what fomented and created the openings for what you saw there. And the problem is not specific to the United States. Let's take a look at another part of the world. It's a tale that you can go all the way back to Tocqueville for. The French aristocrat from the 1800s was exploring these concepts. Some of them were considered radical at the time, but take the old Soviet Union. That was a system that was more command and control, right? So unlike the American view of having checks and balances, something we hear about lately, here you had leaders like these guys running everything. And that meant sometimes that you also had under enforcement because you didn't have regulators who could say anything that was bad news to the people at the very top. And the deadliest nuclear accident in history, we know, occurred because there was a flawed reactor design, and there wasn't the kind of systems and controls to both find the problem and communicate it internally, even if the guys at the top didn't want to hear it. was actually immortalized in a miniseries called Chernobyl, about that Soviet nuclear plant that's also sort of in modern-day Ukraine, but that's a story for another day. But in 1986, it had that deadly, terrible explosion, sending clouds of radiation across Europe. Historians, political scientists say that autocratic countries have more of these kind of problems. So you can think about that with what Trump has said he wants, including a third term. But specifically on these regulatory issues I'm telling you about, you didn't have enough safety measures. Dozens of workers died of poisoning. Thousands of cancer cases were found. There were international investigations and an exploration of the causes.
Most Soviet nuclear plants do not have containment buildings, the thick concrete dome structures Americans are used to seeing built around U.S. reactors.
It was officially considered that all Russian design are absolutely safe, and there is no need to have this containment.
The accident occurred during an unauthorized experiment with safety systems shut down. This followed several years of more than 70 violations found during safety inspections.
The rules were not ruling, so to speak, and there weren't regulations to force fast resolutions of those safety violations or, as you saw there, a requirement to build the reactors inside a containment dome in case an accident were to occur. Now, we even can tell you about a report from an international agency that said the lack of regulatory procedures was one of the key causes of the severity of the meltdown, the reactor brought to a state not specified by those procedures. Half a century after that failure, the plant is decommissioned. There's a productive dome, if you're curious. Protective area there you see. The evacuation zone, though, is still too radioactive for people to enter. And they've spent a ton of money on the cleanup. Now, I could mention the disaster ultimately led to some more international cooperation between nuclear powers and, after the fact, more safety protocols, better regulators, they say, in a country that, since the Soviet era, has, of course, evolved a bit, but had problems with exactly that. But consider how the danger of lax regulation was also brought to life for many Americans by the great Julia Roberts in the 2000 film about the great Erin Brockovich, delving into what might have been for many a seemingly obscure pollution case in the small town of Hinckley, California, and the severe health impacts that partly occurred for the same problem I mentioned earlier, the same Elon Musk approach of not having good, real environmental regulations enforced. Brockovich famously uncovered that.
I'm sorry. I just don't see why you're corresponding with PG&E about your medical problems in the first place.
Well, they paid for the doctor's visit.
Wow. Why'd they do that?
Because of the chromium.
Why'd they do that? Now, that town had toxic chemicals that was dumped into the water, and there was catastrophic fallout and not the right rules in advance to prevent what many viewed as a foreseeable, toxic, dangerous problem.
In the 1950s and 60s, PG&E admits it dumped 26 tons of a coolant made of chromium-6. The chemical is toxic and causes cancer.
Every community that I deal with that has been exposed to chromium-6, they have the same health symptoms.
I've had several stomach surgeries. I've had a hysterectomy. I've had several lumps removed from my breast.
This is a company that has great technology. They certainly have the money. You can't control this plume here in Hinckley after everything that's happened?
It's not complicated. Don't dump cancer, toxic stuff into places where people live. And the people in the position to know how toxic it was, of course, were the people who worked at the company and ran the company, but they were more interested in money. So there's a reason why rules enforced by the government exist in many countries to prevent exactly that kind of thing. Because if the company doesn't face those rules and real-time enforcement, they'll do what you just saw they did. And you or your children could end up sick or dead. I'm speaking very directly because this is the stakes. The company knew what it was doing. They even, after the fact, fought to avoid having to pay for health care for the thing they caused. The film even depicts a meeting between the Brockovich firm and the company where she goes after the company for what it did and calls their bluff on the fact that after the fact they also deceived about the safety of the water.
These people don't dream about being rich. They dream about being able to watch their kids swim in a pool without worrying that they'll have to have a hysterectomy at the age of 20, like Rosa Diaz, a client of ours, or have their spine deteriorate like Stan Bloom, another client of ours. By the way, we had that water brought in special for you folks. Came from well in Hinckley.
Bars. PG&E, in the real world example, had to settle for what at the time was a huge amount of money, over $300 million. It was the largest such settlement at that time. Environmental regulators have tried to work to prevent that from happening to you. As the Erin Brockovich character said, again, based on a real person, people want to live their lives. They shouldn't have to think about this all the time. And if we don't slash all these government rules, they don't have to think about it. But that's the issue around those chemicals. Regulators were still fought by industry. California only recently became what is the first state to order a phase out of those chemicals in that same Hinckley community. Now, safety experts have long warned regulations are written in blood, meaning the history is bloody, injurious, or sometimes involves avoidable death. That there are dangerous consequences with lives at stake, and the rules come out of those past histories written in blood, but sometimes trying to ensure no more blood in the future. But you ignore them at your peril. This is the nonpartisan safety and security background to all of the Trump cuts that hit safety regulations, nuclear power plants. Deregulation, the Wall Street Journal says, will be a new high watermark. In other words, if true, if they get to where they want to go, they will deregulate more than ever before, which includes the examples I just showed you, and you saw the results. Now, the administration and its MAGA allies often say this is also about saving money, and you hear talk about the government being too expensive at the federal level. But many of tonight's examples show how corporations are often pushing against what they view as rules that cut into their money. Not your taxpayer dollars, their profits. To say nothing of the safety of the people who live in this country and fund the government, and also, by the way, are consumers for those businesses. So with that in mind, I want you to notice now, I said sometimes you got to go back in history to then come back to the present. Who's leading this deregulation purge? It's a billionaire business person. Here's Elon Musk on regulations.
Regulations basically should be default gone. Default gone, not default there, default gone. And if it turns out that we missed the mark on a regulation, we always add it back in.
If we missed a mark, add it back in. Does that sound like a good idea once the toxic cancer chemicals are in the land? Then add it back in afterwards? Musk is leading an effort that is Donald Trump's plan and power. He is ultimately responsible. They're purging employees. They're eliminating the few people on the job that look out for your safety, including in toxic and nuclear contexts, enforcement of rules that do the type of prevention of exactly the catastrophes we've discussed tonight, which paves the way for the risk of those things happening again or worse. They're going directly after health agencies that do exactly the kind of screenings and rules that I talked about tonight. At home, Trump's health secretary has halted data collection on everything from cancer to HIV. Experts say we will be more vulnerable for years to come because some of these things have long-term consequences. They're also blocking data around vaccines. We showed you tonight harrowing examples of what it looks like when governments, ours or others, cut too many rules. It's dangerous for you. That includes the 2008 financial crash, which spread in all sorts of deep, long-term ways, includes contaminated water that got people sick, and the government oversight failures, and having people in charge who just want to cut all the regulators and deal with the bailouts and the bankruptcies later. So as they purge these agencies and cut funding, this could affect you, your health, and the well-being of the people in this country. I say that based on the facts and the history, without any view of partisanship or even the personalities involved, which sometimes get so much attention. If your problem with Elon Musk is that you don't like his style, that's a whole other conversation. But the problem we see tonight is that Elon Musk, empowered by Donald Trump, on behalf of a business history that doesn't like costly rules that cut into their profits, he is wrong. wrong in ways that could prove catastrophic.